What if I told you during the Great Depression, survival meant turning scraps into supper? From hot water, cornbread made with nothing but cornmeal and boiling water, to Hoppin John, a humble yet hearty mix of rice and black-eyed peas. These dishes weren't just about filling stomachs, they were lifelines. If you've ever wondered how resilience tasted, this list is for you. Here are 15 shocking foods African Americans ate during the Great Depression. Hot water cornbread. Picture this with me for a moment. So the Great Depression is raging, cupboards are bare, and the ingredients for fancy breads are out of reach. Yet, in the hands of African American families, magic still happened in the kitchen. Out of necessity came hot water cornbread, one of the simplest yet most iconic foods of survival. Imagine cornmeal meeting nothing more than boiling hot water and a pinch of salt, then shaped by hand into patties and fried until golden. That's it. No yeast, no milk, no butter, no eggs, just grit, cornmeal, and creativity. This dish was born from African flatbread traditions carried across the Atlantic and reimagined on American soil. Corn was abundant in the South, so cornmeal became the star. By simply adding hot water, it created a dough that could be molded and fried over an open flame or in a cast iron skillet. This was a food that made family members gather around, dipping these crispy patties into beans, soups, or even molasses if they were lucky enough to have some. But here's the fun part. Despite its humble beginnings, hot water cornbread never lost its charm. It became a family favorite, often served alongside collard greens or black-eyed peas, transforming a poor man's necessity into a beloved Southern comfort food. And let's be honest, who doesn't love a golden, crunchy bread that sings with flavor even when it's made from almost nothing? During the Great Depression, hot water cornbread carried families through hunger. It showed that even when life served you hardship, you could still make something beautiful out of nothing that'll end up filling your stomach and downright delicious. Today, this crispy little patty maintains its crown as an evidence of history that you can taste and a symbol of resilience, fried golden brown. Hoppin John. Now let's move on to a one-pot miracle that could stretch to feed a family, even when money was tight. Enter Hoppin John, the Great Depression superstar. At its heart, it's nothing more than rice, black-eyed peas, and a little seasoning, yet it managed to be hearty, flavorful, and deeply satisfying. This dish didn't appear out of nowhere. Its roots run deep into West African traditions, where rice and beans were staples long before the first Africans were brought to the Americas. Enslaved Africans carried the knowledge of rice farming and bean cooking, and over time these skills transformed into dishes like Hoppin John. By the time of the Depression, it was already a household favorite in Black Southern kitchens. Cooking Hoppin John was a ritual of making the most out of little. You'd start with rice, toss in black-eyed peas or field peas, and flavor it with whatever you had. Maybe a ham hock, maybe just onions and salt, if times were hard. The magic came in the slow simmer, where all those humble ingredients blended into something so tasteful it felt like a feast. Families often gathered around a single steaming pot, scooping hearty spoonfuls onto plates, feeling the warmth in their bellies and the hope in their hearts. Hoppin John was a dish that's strongly tied to tradition and luck. On New Year's Day, it was eaten with collard greens and cornbread as a symbol of prosperity for the year ahead. Black-eyed peas represented coins, greens meant paper money, and cornbread stood for gold. Imagine families in the harshest of times still clinging to hope, believing that this simple pot of rice and peas held the power to turn their fortunes around. And here's the kicker. Hoppin John isn't just surviving food, it's thriving food. Even today, it still graces tables across the South, proving that resilience tastes incredible when simmered with history and heart. Collard greens. Next up is the leafy green hero of survival, collard greens. During the Great Depression, when meat was scarce and vegetables were limited, collard greens became the star of the pot. They were hearty, they were filling, and they could be coaxed into deliciousness with a little time, patience, and creativity. Collards had long been part of African American foodways, tracing back to African leafy greens that enslaved people adapted to the plants available in the South. When life pressed families hard, these greens became more than just vegetables. They became lifesavers. Tossed into a big pot, collard greens were often simmered low and slow with pork scraps if they could be found. Ham hocks, fatback, or bacon ends were the dream pairing, but if nothing was available, onions, garlic, and salt did the job. Cooking collard greens was a ritual that filled homes with an aroma that spoke of comfort even in the darkest times. The broth at the bottom, called pot liquor, was liquid gold. People would soak it up with hot water cornbread or drink it straight, knowing that no nutrient could go to waste. Collard greens weren't just about flavor, they were about survival. But beyond the pot, collard greens carried a powerful cultural meaning that symbolized strength, resilience, and even prosperity. During New Year's celebrations, collards were eaten alongside black-eyed peas and cornbread, bringing the promise of wealth and good fortune. Even during the Great Depression, when money was scarce and hope was fragile, collard greens gave people something bigger than a meal. They gave them tradition and belief. What made collard greens so incredible was their ability to transform. What started as tough, bitter leaves turned tender and savory after hours of simmering. That transformation mirrored the lives of those who cooked them, enduring hardship but emerging stronger, richer, and full of flavor. Collard greens weren't just food, they were resilience simmered in a pot, served with love, and a whole lot of soul. Chitterlings, chitlins. Now buckle up, because this one is not for the faint of heart. Chitterlings, or chitlins as they're fondly called, are pig intestines. Yes, you heard me right, intestines. But before you turn away, let's talk about why this dish became a legend of survival during the Great Depression. For centuries, African Americans made magic from the parts of the animal nobody else wanted. Chitlins were considered scraps, often thrown out or discarded. But resourceful hands knew how to transform them into something edible and even celebratory. Cleaning chitlins was no easy task, as it was messy and smelly, and it took hours of work. Yet families went through the trouble because when cooked right, chitlins became a delicacy that filled the table and bellies alike. During the Depression, when nothing could go to waste, chitlins became an important source of protein. They were usually boiled slowly to tenderize them, sometimes with onions, peppers, or vinegar to tame the strong flavor. After that, they might be fried until crispy or simmered until soft. Served with hot sauce or cornbread, they became a dish that turned poverty into pride. Chitlins reminded people of their roots, of the resourcefulness passed down from ancestors who made something out of nothing. Even when times were crushingly hard, chitlins gave people a reason to come together, laugh, and share. Today, chitlins are still available. You either love them or you don't. But during the Great Depression, there was no room for debate. They were survival, plain and simple. They were a testament to creativity, resilience, and the refusal to let hunger win. Chitlins prove one thing loud and clear: with enough heart and ingenuity, even the humblest ingredients can become soul food worth remembering. What's next on the menu will blow your mind through the roof. These dishes are so bold and surprising, you'll never look at survival food the same again. Hoover stew. If a single pot could tell the story of survival, it would be Hoover stew. Born in the early 1930s and named in bitter jest after President Herbert Hoover, this was the soup kitchen superstar. Picture elbow macaroni bubbling in tomato juice, rings of hot dog or bologna sliding across the surface, and sometimes beans or corn added when the pantry blessed you with extras. By 1933, unemployment hovered around 1 in 4 Americans, so the genius of Hoover stew was simple. It stretched pennies into plates. Church basements, settlement houses, and relief depots ladled it into tin bowls all day long. Federal relief programs began shipping surplus canned tomatoes, pork and beans, and pasta to local charities, so the stew became a natural mashup of whatever arrived in the crate. Families copied the idea at home because it delivered calories, protein, and comfort in the same steaming scoop. Kids loved the hot dog coins. Adults loved that a single pot could feed a crowd without burning the gas meter for hours. It was not fancy, it was dependable. That is why it became a favorite. It tasted the same on Tuesday as it did on Friday, and sameness was a blessing when everything else felt uncertain. Many households paired a bowl with hot water cornbread or the heel of yesterday's loaf and called it a feast. A big pot of Hoover stew could sit on the back burner while people came and went from odd jobs, and there would still be enough for a late plate. Newspapers printed thrifty recipes, mothers traded ratios on front stoops, and school cafeterias adopted it because it scaled beautifully. The stew turned shame into pride. It said, "We will eat, we will laugh, and we will make tomorrow happen." That is why it lives in memory more than macaroni and tomatoes. It was a lifeline that tasted like hope. Grits, stone ground. Before brunch, menus began dressing them up in truffle and shrimp. Grits were the bedrock of survival. Stone ground corn simmered in water until it turned soft and steaming, then seasoned with whatever you had. Butter if fortune smiled, bacon drippings if there was any, salt and a splash of milk on a good day. A pound of dry cornmeal or grits contains roughly 1,600 to 1,700 calories, which means a single sack could carry a family for days. In the 1930s, that mattered more than anything. African American cooks already knew corn inside out. Generations had leaned on porridge, mush, and cakes that echoed African and indigenous foodways. During the Great Depression, that knowledge paid the rent. Small-town mills would grind a neighbor's corn for a tiny fee or in trade, and grits kept their quality in a cool pantry. Families ate them at sunrise before fieldwork, again at midday with a ladle of pot liquor from greens. Then the leftovers were poured into a pan to set. Next day, those firm slices were fried crisp and served with onions or gravy. Nothing wasted. Why did grits become a favorite? Price, stamina, and versatility. They were cheap at the grocer, even cheaper when milled from a neighbor's corn. They filled you without weighing you down, which meant strength for picking, washing, hauling, and walking. They played well with everything. A spoon of stewed tomatoes, a scatter of cheese ends, a crumble of sausage, or simply pepper and salt. Extension agents and church ladies taught thrift classes that always included corn cookery. You could feed 6 from one pot and still scrape enough for a child's bowl at bedtime. In a decade when so many dinners were thin, grits gave body to the table and dignity to the cook. That soft, steady spoonful tasted like security, and that is why it never left Southern kitchens. Sweet potatoes and yams. Call them sweets, call them yams, call them lifesavers. Sweet potatoes were the bright orange anchor of the pantry when money was short and bellies were empty. Southern farms grew them in abundance. They stored well in sheds and cellars, and they delivered serious nutrition for pennies. One medium sweet potato can provide several times the daily need for vitamin A, a vital boost in a time when malnutrition stalked poor communities. No wonder they were everywhere during the Great Depression. African American gardeners planted slips in rows behind shotgun houses and along fence lines. County fairs gave prizes for the heaviest specimens. When harvest came, families roasted them in ashes, mashed them with a little evaporated milk, tucked them into pies for Sunday, and diced them into stews to sweeten a salty pot. Children carried foil-wrapped sweets in jacket pockets as portable lunches. Street vendors baked them and sold them hot from barrels on chilly evenings. They became a favorite because they felt like a treat, even when there was no sugar to spare. Natural sweetness transformed bitter days. Cooks folded mashed sweet potato into biscuit dough to stretch wheat flour, stirred it into puddings when eggs were scarce, and candied slices in a skillet with a spoon of sorghum or a sprinkle of brown sugar when the cupboard allowed. Leftovers were never a problem because there were never leftovers. Relief gardens pushed them because yields were steady, even in poor soil. The math was simple: cheap to plant, easy to store, rich in energy, beloved by children, and kind to the cook. In a decade when every bite needed to do real work, the sweet potato pulled double shifts with a smile. That is how a humble root became a star. Catfish, fried. If you lived near a river, a creek, or a pond, you already knew the secret. Supper swam within reach. Catfish became a Great Depression favorite because it asked for very little and gave so much. A cane pole and patience could bring home dinner. Clean the fillets, soak them in buttermilk if you had it, dredge in seasoned cornmeal, then slide them into hot fat until the crust sings. The first crackle in that skillet could make a whole house feel rich. For African American communities across the Delta, the Midlands, and the Gulf states, fish fries were more than meals. They were gatherings. Saturday nights behind churches, fundraisers on school lawns, neighbors pulling up with pans of grits, slaw, and sliced white bread, while the fish came out golden and steaming. In lean years, protein was the hardest thing to secure. Catfish answered that need with flavor, abundance, and community. Why did it become a favorite during the Great Depression? Access and economy. A dozen hooks on a trot line could bring in enough fish to feed an extended family. Cornmeal was already in the pantry. Lard saved from bacon or rendered from trimmings became frying oil. The entire plate cost little more than time and care. There is a quiet statistic behind the joy. Freshwater fish became a regular feature on Southern tables because it required almost no cash, only skill and persistence. The payoff was huge. Crispy outside, tender inside, the kind of meal that made children dance and grown folks hum. Leftovers, if there were any, became sandwiches for church the next day. Fried catfish turned scarcity into celebration. It taught that a riverbank can be a marketplace, that a skillet can be a stage, and that a shared table can make hard weeks feel lighter. One bite, a squeeze of lemon, a shake of hot sauce, and suddenly tomorrow looked possible again. We've only just tasted the beginning, but the next dishes we will explore is going to take survival and resilience to a whole new flavorful level. Brace yourself. Black-eyed peas. If there's one humble food that carried more than just good taste during the Great Depression, it was black-eyed peas. For African American families, these tiny legumes weren't just something you threw in a pot. Black-eyed peas had long been tied to prosperity, and eating them on New Year's Day was believed to bring luck. But during the 1930s, they weren't eaten for luck. They were eaten for survival. Packed with protein, fiber, and iron, black-eyed peas were a nutritional powerhouse at a time when many families struggled to put any kind of protein on the table. Dried peas were cheap, could be stored for months, and could stretch across multiple meals. Families simmered them into hearty stews, paired them with rice, or seasoned them with ham hocks, smoked turkey, or whatever scraps they had. Imagine a steaming pot bubbling on a wood stove, the smell of spices filling the kitchen, and everyone gathered with bowls in hand. By the early 1930s, with unemployment soaring over 20%, black-eyed peas became one of the most consumed legumes in African American households across the South. They were filling, versatile, and most importantly, affordable. And let's be real, when seasoned just right, they didn't taste like survival food at all. They tasted like home. Peanut soup/gumbo-style stews. Now this right here is deliciousness with a passport. Peanut soup, also known in some kitchens as ground nut soup, carried its roots straight from West Africa to African American tables. Long before the Great Depression, enslaved Africans brought with them not just skills, but recipes that would forever shape Southern cuisine. When the Depression hit, peanut-based soups and gumbo-style stews became lifesavers. Why? Because peanuts were cheap, filling, and available in abundance. The base was simple. Peanuts or peanut butter simmered down with onions, spices, sometimes tomatoes, and whatever protein you could find. If meat was scarce, you still had a thick, creamy, savory dish that could stretch over rice or bread. African American families used gumbo-style cooking to make something out of nothing, throwing in greens, beans, or fish when available. What made peanut soup special was how it turned scarcity into richness. Even without meat, the flavor was bold and comforting. And it was nutritious. Peanuts provided protein and healthy fats when diets were otherwise stripped bare. In some communities, peanut stews became a Sunday ritual, connecting families back to their African heritage, even in the middle of economic despair. This was food that reminded people who they were, even when times tried to strip everything else away. Boiled peanuts. Now I want you to picture this with me for a moment. On a hot summer afternoon, neighbors gathered on porches and a pot of green peanuts boiling away in salty water. That was boiled peanuts. Simple, salty, addictive, and one of the cheapest Depression-era snacks you could find. For African Americans in the South, this wasn't just snacking, it was heritage. The tradition of boiling peanuts came directly from West African foodways, where legumes were often softened and flavored to create easy portable meals. During the Great Depression, peanuts were nicknamed the poor man's protein. They were cheap to grow, easy to harvest, and full of nutrients like protein and vitamin E. Families would buy or grow green peanuts, boil them in salty water for hours until they softened, and then serve them warm in paper bags. They weren't crunchy like roasted peanuts. They were soft, briny, and packed with flavor. Kids loved them because they felt like a treat, and adults loved them because they were cheap and filling. By the 1930s, roadside stands selling hot-boiled peanuts popped up across the South, turning them into not just a food, but a social experience. They became symbols of people still snacking smart in times of scarcity. Even today, when people crack open a bag of hot-boiled peanuts, it carries the same spirit of survival and togetherness from the Depression years. Jambalaya. If resilience had a taste, it would be jambalaya. This one-pot wonder didn't just feed families, it brought entire communities together. Originating from West African one-pot rice dishes like jollof, jambalaya became a staple in African American kitchens across Louisiana and the Deep South. During the Great Depression, when every penny mattered, jambalaya was the ultimate answer to how do we feed everyone with what little we have. The magic was in its flexibility. Start with rice, add whatever protein was available, chicken, sausage, seafood if you were lucky, or scraps if you weren't. Then throw in spices, vegetables, and broth. Before long, you had a dish that could stretch to feed a whole family or even a church gathering. And because rice was cheap and filling, jambalaya kept bellies full without draining wallets. In African American communities, jambalaya became a meal that families shared at reunions, neighbors brought to gatherings, and it symbolizes togetherness when times were hardest. By the 1930s, rice consumption in the South skyrocketed, with jambalaya standing out as one of the most beloved ways to prepare it. Every spoonful carried layers of history, West African roots, Creole seasoning, and Depression-era resourcefulness. For those who sat around a pot of jambalaya during those years, it wasn't just dinner. It was hope served with a side of spice. Each spoonful of these dishes isn't just food, it's a history lesson on survival. And if you want to know what resilience that feeds generations look like, then go grab a cup of water and chill. Gumbo, peanut or okra-based. If food could sing, gumbo would be the choir director. This dish didn't just stroll into African American kitchens. Gumbo traces its roots directly to West Africa, where okra and peanuts were household essentials. Africans who came through the Middle Passage brought both the seeds and the skill of turning humble ingredients into feasts that stretched to feed entire communities. In the South, gumbo became the ultimate one-pot wonder, thickened either with okra or peanuts, with each spoonful telling a story of survival and adaptation. During the Great Depression, gumbo quickly rose through the ranks to become a major lifeline for many African American households who might have not been able to do any better for themselves. The best part about preparing a gumbo is that you can choose to add scraps of meat, wild-caught seafood, leftover rice, or even just greens to it, and it'll still turn it into a pot of nourishment for you and your family members to enjoy. Why gumbo? Because it was flexible, filling, and fun. It turned a little into enough for everybody. It is said that gumbo was served at church gatherings, social events, and Sunday dinners because it carried both flavor and fellowship. People didn't just eat gumbo, they celebrated it. The beauty of gumbo is how it blended traditions. From the West African love of peanuts and okra to the Native American use of filet powder, ground sassafras leaves for thickening, to French and Spanish stewing techniques, it was a cultural handshake in every bite. And let's not lie, gumbo has always been about community. Nobody makes just a tiny pot, gumbo demands a crowd. Today, whether you're spooning into a peanut-thick gumbo or the classic okra-based version, you're tasting centuries of resilience and creativity. Gumbo wasn't just food during hard times, it was an anthem that said, "We will survive, and we'll do it deliciously." Biscuits. Light, fluffy, golden on the outside, and melt in your mouth. Soft on the inside, biscuits are the quiet hero of African American kitchens. You might think they are just bread, but trust me, biscuits were much more than food. They were survival, comfort, and sometimes even the centerpiece of a meal during hard times. The story of biscuits begins long before they became a Southern staple. They evolved from short dough breads in Europe, where bakers used simple ingredients like flour, fat, and liquid to create hearty bread that could be prepared quickly. When biscuits made their way into African American homes, they became something entirely unique. Enslaved women, often charged with baking for plantation households, brought their own techniques and resourcefulness to the table. With little more than flour, lard, and milk, they crafted tender biscuits that could soak up gravy, gumbo, or pot liquor, the rich broth left behind from slow-cooked greens. No drop of flavor was wasted, and biscuits became the perfect partner to stretch meals and maximize nourishment. During the Great Depression, biscuits took on an even greater role. With meat scarce and vegetables needing to be stretched, flour became the hero of the kitchen. It was cheap, accessible, and when mixed with a little baking powder and fat, biscuits came alive. They transformed the simplest meals into something filling and satisfying. Families could prepare large batches, enough to last through the day, and share them with neighbors. In many communities, biscuits became more than food. They became a symbol of generosity, often carried to church gatherings, socials, and community suppers. They were glue for community life, reminding everyone that even in scarcity, there could be abundance through sharing. Imagine it. Breakfast was not complete without biscuits slathered with syrup, honey, or homemade jam. Lunchtime might feature biscuits split open and filled with greens, beans, or even leftover fish. Dinner was often rounded off with biscuits on the side of a stew, soaking up every last drop of flavor. Biscuits carried meals when there was little else on the table, and they did it with style, comfort, and grace. Today, biscuits remain soul food royalty, but when you bite into one, remember it is not just soft, buttery goodness. It is the taste of creativity, resilience, and strength from communities who learn to make magic out of the humblest ingredient, flour. Butter beans or lima beans. Butter beans, known in some regions as lima beans, may not shout like fried chicken or strut like sweet potato pie, but make no mistake, they have always been soul food royalty. Affordable, filling, and packed with nutrients, butter beans became a dependable backbone for African American families, especially during hard times like the Great Depression. Why butter beans? First, they were cheap. A single bag of dried beans could stretch into several meals, feeding a whole family with little more than seasoning and patience. Second, they were versatile. You could simmer them slow with onions and peppers until tender, mash them into creamy spreads, or let them bubble away in broths alongside smoked turkey wings or pork bones. In African American kitchens, butter beans became hearty meals that needed no fancy ingredients to shine. Their roots run deeper than the Depression. Lima beans originated in South America, but once they crossed the Atlantic, they found a natural home in West African cooking traditions. Legumes and beans were already central to many African stews and porridges, so enslaved Africans carried those culinary skills to the Americas. Out of necessity and creativity, they transformed simple beans into flavorful pots that could sustain entire communities. By the 1930s, during the worst years of the Depression, butter beans often replaced meat. With protein-rich content and belly-filling texture, they became the star of the table. A steaming pot of butter beans served with cornbread or biscuits was enough to keep hunger at bay. Families would gather around the table, and though the meal was simple, it was deeply satisfying. Nobody went to bed hungry after a plate of beans done right. Butter beans were also about togetherness. They were cooked in large pots on Sundays, dished out generously to neighbors, and carried to church suppers and community gatherings. Their buttery texture, especially when cooked down with a little fat, turned them into comfort food at its finest. They were not just beans, they were a symbol of community care and resilience. Even today, butter beans remain a staple in Southern and African American kitchens. Every spoonful tells a story of survival and ingenuity, proof that with just a handful of beans, a pot, and creativity, families could create something warm, nourishing, and unforgettable. Quick question: which of these foods did you ever get the chance to actually taste or maybe heard your nan talk about while growing up? Drop it in the comments below. We might feature your story in the next video.